My name is Sarah and I'm 27. I am a cashier at a local hardware store. Not glamorous, not high paying, but honest work. And I like it. I like helping people find what they need, answering questions, and seeing a small sense of satisfaction in a customer walking out happy. My life has always been simple, predictable, and comfortable. And then I met Ethan. Ethan is 29, charming, magnetic, and dangerous in ways I didn't understand at first. He bartends downtown at a trendy spot where he makes more in tips in a single night than I do in a week. He has this effortless way of drawing people to him, a laugh that fills a room, and a smile that makes you forget everything else. We met at a friend's birthday party. He was making everyone laugh, and I, naturally shy, stood on the sidelines, quietly observing. Our first conversation was brief, but electric. He noticed me instantly, complimented the way I laughed at a joke no one else had, and somehow made me feel like the only person in the room. Over the next few weeks, our paths kept crossing, friends inviting both of us to dinners, casual meetups, nights out. I was drawn to him, and he seemed genuinely interested in me. Before long, we were dating. The first few months felt like a dream. Ethan was attentive, funny, and exciting in a way that made my quiet world feel bigger. We explored the city together, trying new restaurants, going to concerts, meeting his friends, even meeting his family. His parents were warm, but had their expectations. They liked me, cautiously, yet there was always a subtle undertone that I wasn't quite enough. I didn't mind. I wanted to be part of his life, and I tried to understand their subtle concerns, even bending over backward to impress them. And then, slowly, the first cracks appeared. Little things I brushed off at the time, his hand lingering on a friend's shoulder a moment too long, texts he hid when I looked over, laughing a little too intimately with female coworkers. When I asked, he'd smile and say, "You're imagining things. You're too sensitive." I told myself he was right, that maybe I was imagining things. I wanted to believe in him, in us. I tried to ignore the growing unease in my chest, the knot that formed every time he disappeared for a few hours without explanation, or when he made casual comments about other women being attractive. Friends noticed it too. Colt, my coworker, once mentioned, half-jokingly, "He's got charm for days. Don't let him charm you into ignoring yourself." I laughed it off then, but his words lingered in the back of my mind. Ethan's world was vibrant, social, and fast-paced. Mine was steady, grounded. I loved being pulled into his life, meeting people I'd never have known, feeling like I belonged in a larger, exciting story. Yet deep down, I sometimes wondered if he truly wanted me, or if he just liked having me along. There were moments, fleeting glances, lingering touches with others, invitations to parties where I felt invisible, that planted seeds of doubt. Still, I trusted him. I loved him, and despite subtle warning signs, I dismissed the unease, telling myself relationships required patience, compromise, and forgiveness. I remembered the nights we stayed up talking for hours, him brushing my hair behind my ear, our fingers entwined as he whispered dreams about the future. Those moments felt real. They were real, but they were only a part of the story, one carefully curated to make me feel special. By the time the party with Mara rolled around, I had been 8 months in love with a man whose charm could blind the most cautious heart. The subtle hints of manipulation, of emotional distance, of disregard for my boundaries, they had been there all along. I just hadn't seen them clearly. And as I walked into that house, feeling the usual excitement of being part of Ethan's social orbit, I had no idea that night would be the one where everything I thought I knew would unravel in front of me. Over the past few months, I had started noticing little things, subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but enough to make my chest tighten in ways I couldn't ignore. Ethan's laughter sometimes lingered a second too long with other women. His phone buzzed at odd hours, and there were conversations I wasn't meant to see. Every time I asked, he'd smile that effortless, infuriating smile and say, "You're imagining things. Relax." And of course, I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust the man I loved. It started with small pushes, small tests of my boundaries. At his work events, he would linger just a little too close to female coworkers while explaining a project, laugh a little too intimately at jokes that weren't funny to anyone else, and brush off my discomfort with a casual, "I'm just being friendly." Friends noticed too. Mara, his party-obsessed friend, once leaned over during a casual gathering and whispered, "He's fun, isn't he? But sometimes I think he likes to see how far he can push people." I laughed it off then, trying to convince myself I wasn't part of the test. I replay those moments now, watching how he subtly shifted conversations when I joined in, the way his arm would rest a little too naturally on someone else's shoulder, the way his eyes would light up at someone else's joke while my comments barely earned a glance. Each incident alone could have been innocent. Taken together, they painted a pattern that I was too blinded by love to see clearly. Family and friends also began to weigh in, sometimes unintentionally feeding the tension. His sister would make offhand comments about me not being ambitious enough. His parents would ask questions that felt like tests of my worth, and even friends would casually remark, "He's charming, but he likes the attention." I hated to admit it, but these little nudges gnawed at me. Was I overreacting, or was something really off? Then there were the moments in public, the social situations where boundaries blurred. At bars, at casual parties, Ethan's attention would occasionally drift. A lingering touch, a whispered joke, a glance that lingered too long. My heart would clench, my fingers tightening around my drink, yet every time I confronted him, he turned the tables. "You're being jealous," he'd say, his tone both teasing and accusing, and I'd find myself apologizing, not for my feelings, but for daring to feel it all. I remember one night vividly. We were at a friend's rooftop party, city lights sparkling beneath us, music pulsing softly. Ethan got up to greet someone I didn't know, and I watched as he threw his arm casually around her waist, leaned in close, and laughed at something I couldn't hear. The jealousy, the sudden fear, washed over me, but before I could say anything, he returned to me with that same charming grin and a kiss that should have reassured me, but didn't. That night, I lay awake replaying the scene, questioning my own perceptions. Was I imagining it all, or was he carefully showing me a side of himself meant to test me? It wasn't just him, though. I started seeing patterns in myself, too. How I excused behaviors, overlooked comments, rationalized actions that made me uncomfortable. I remembered months ago when I hesitated to voice concerns about his flirtations at work, telling myself, "He's just being friendly." I remembered buying into his playful excuses for his attention to other women, convincing myself it didn't matter. And yet, in the quiet corners of my mind, doubt had begun to take root. By the time Mara's party came around, the night everything would come crashing down, I was already walking on eggshells, unsure if my love and trust were enough to withstand the subtle erosion happening all around me. The cold reality was beginning to form. I wasn't imagining things. The behaviors, the dismissals, the tests, they weren't accidents. And the unease I had been carrying in my chest was no longer something I could ignore. Something was coming, and deep down, I knew that the seed of conflict was ready to bloom. The night of Mara's party started like any other. Laughing friends, clinking glasses, warm lights spilling across the living room, but it didn't take long for the tension to settle like a stone in my stomach. I had known, intellectually, that there were warning signs with Ethan, but nothing prepared me for the sheer clarity of what I was about to see. By the time the game of truth or dare began, the room was buzzing with energy. I tried to remind myself to relax, to enjoy the laughter and music, but every instinct in my body was alert. When it was Ethan's turn, someone dared him to sit on the lap of the most attractive person at the party. My throat went dry. A dare. Harmless, temporary, I told myself. Yet the way he looked around the room, the deliberate pause, the slight smirk as he scanned options, it was already different. My heart began to pound. He walked over to Catherine, a contractor friend of Mara's. Tall, confident, a presence that seemed to dominate any space he entered. Catherine didn't hesitate. She settled on Evan's lap with a smile that was not playful, not casual, but intimate, close enough for me to notice the warmth in their interaction, the way their knees touched, the way Catherine's hand lingered briefly on Ethan's waist. My pulse spiked, my chest tightening as an icy dread crawled through me. "Hey," I said, my voice steady but quiet, stepping closer. The dare's over. Can you not be so jealous? Ethan cut me off, loud enough that several friends turned to look. His tone was sharp, annoyed. It's just a game. Learn to have fun. I froze. His words didn't sting with denial or apology. They stung with dismissive certainty. My breath caught in my throat. I had felt tension before, yes, but this was different. Cold clarity struck me like a punch to the chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't harmless. This was a deliberate public disregard for my feelings. Time seemed to stretch, my heart hammering against my ribs as I watched them. Ethan leaning back, resting comfortably against Catherine, whispering, laughing, intimate, private gestures in front of everyone, as if I wasn't even there. My hands, curled into fists at my sides, shook slightly. My throat burned. I wanted to speak, to demand respect, but the words refused to form coherently. The room faded around me, the music dull, the laughter distant. I realized then that I wasn't angry in the usual sense. It wasn't jealousy. It was a piercing recognition of betrayal. Months of subtle tests, dismissals, and boundary pushing crystallized in a single moment. I had been used as a placeholder, a comforting presence while he explored other options. Every warning sign I had ignored, every rationalization I had made, everything I had hoped would resolve itself, it all came rushing back in a tidal wave of clarity. I stepped back, my fingers brushing the note I had hastily scribbled before leaving. Words I hadn't yet spoken aloud, but felt perfectly true. Not jealous anymore. Not your girlfriend either. The weight of months of emotional labor, of self-doubt and excused behaviors, settled on my shoulders, crushing yet liberating. I realized I didn't need explanations, promises, or rehearsed apologies. I needed to step away, to reclaim myself before I lost more of who I was. So I walked. Quietly, deliberately, I turned on my heel and left the party. The city night was cool against my face, my pulse still racing, the sounds of laughter and music fading behind me. Every step felt like shedding an invisible chain, a chain that had bound my sense of self to someone who saw me as nothing more than a project, a temporary fixture in his life. By the time I reached my friend Colt's apartment, the adrenaline had ebbed slightly, leaving a hollow, echoing clarity. I packed a bag, placed it carefully by the door, and set the note on the kitchen counter. The words, stark and final, captured the truth I had only just fully grasped. I wasn't jealous anymore. I was free. As I sat on Colt's couch, sipping coffee in the pre-dawn quiet, my mind replayed every interaction, every subtle dismissal, every moment of creeping unease. For the first time, I saw the pattern with unflinching honesty. This wasn't about a game. This wasn't about misunderstanding or insecurity. This was about respect, or the lack of it. And I realized that walking away wasn't weakness, it was courage. For the first time in months, I felt grounded, clear-headed, unburdened. My heart still ached, yes, but it ached with understanding rather than confusion. And in that understanding, I found the beginning of freedom, a freedom that would carry me through the coming weeks, and the weeks after that, as I unraveled the full extent of Ethan's deceit. Sitting in Colt's apartment the morning after, I couldn't shake the images from my mind. The laughter, the whispers, the intimate closeness between Ethan and Catherine. It all played on repeat like a cruel film. My chest felt tight, every heartbeat echoing the betrayal. And yet, I wasn't angry in the explosive, cinematic way people might expect. I was quiet, icy, resolute. Something deep inside me had shifted. I replayed the months leading up to that night, the subtle boundary tests, the dismissals of my discomfort, the excuses I had made for him, for the relationship. I asked myself the same question over and over. What did I miss? Where did I go wrong? Was I too trusting? Too patient? And then, slowly, clarity emerged. None of it was my fault. None of it. I had loved him fully, given him my trust, my attention, my energy. The problem had never been me. It had been him. I thought about the conversations I had ignored, the red flags I had rationalized. Every time he told me I was too sensitive for expressing discomfort, I had blamed myself. Every time he lingered a little too long with someone else, I had convinced myself it was harmless. I had worked so hard to maintain peace, to nurture a love I believed in, that I hadn't realized I was being systematically disrespected. But it wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization of how long I had been living in a haze, excusing behaviors that anyone with a clearer perspective would have recognized as toxic. I had wanted to believe, and in doing so, I had ignored the truth staring me in the face. And now that truth was impossible to ignore. Colt, ever the patient friend, gave me space to process. He didn't try to offer solutions or force me to speak. He just made coffee, sat nearby, and let me breathe. Eventually, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the barrage of frantic messages Ethan had sent since I left. Confusion, anger, pleading. They blurred into a single pattern. Every word he typed only reinforced what I had already realized. He had treated our relationship as a game, testing my limits, gauging my patience, measuring my attachment. By mid-morning, I knew I had to confront him. Not to argue, not to plead, not to salvage what had been broken, but to face the reality with intention, to ensure I was stepping forward with clarity rather than blind emotion. I called him, and when he answered, I could hear the surprise, the hesitation. "Where are you?" he asked, voice tight with urgency. "I'm at Colt's," I said calmly. My voice didn't tremble, though my fingers tightened around the phone. "We need to talk." There was a pause, long enough to remind me how much control I had lost over my own feelings, over the space he had occupied in my life. I didn't mean for it to get this far," he said finally. I didn't respond immediately. I let the weight of the silence stretch between us. Then, slowly, I spoke, each word deliberate, measured. "You pushed boundaries, Ethan. I told you when I was uncomfortable. You dismissed my feelings, laughed in front of our friends, and treated me as if my trust didn't matter. That's not love. That's not respect." His sigh was audible, a mixture of frustration and surprise. "It was just a game," he said. I felt a shiver run down my spine, not of fear, but of cold, resolute understanding. "A game?" I repeated. "A game doesn't last for hours, with your arms around someone else while you tell me I'm being jealous. A game doesn't make me feel invisible in front of everyone I care about. A game doesn't require months of manipulation to test my patience." He started stammering, but I cut him off. "I've spent months rationalizing your behavior. I've given you every chance to respect my boundaries. And now I see clearly, this isn't about fun. It's about you seeing how far you could push me and still have me stay." For the first time, I felt a strange calmness settle in. The knot in my chest loosened slightly. I wasn't pleading. I wasn't angry in a desperate way. I was stating a truth that had taken months of pain to recognize. "I'm done," I said. "I'm done excusing you. I'm done hoping for the person you promised me you were. I'm done being a placeholder while you explored other options." The line went silent for a moment. Then he muttered something I didn't even register. I hung up. It wasn't about punishment. It was about reclaiming myself, about stepping out of a relationship that had systematically eroded my trust and self-worth. Sitting back on the couch, I finally allowed myself to breathe fully, to feel the weight lift from my shoulders. The shock, the sadness, the hurt, they were still there, but they no longer had power over me. For the first time in months, I felt in control, fully present, and capable of choosing myself over someone who had never truly valued me. The days following that night became a blur of messages, calls, and unwelcome interventions. Ethan's friends and family, sensing the shift in our dynamic, began weighing in. At first it was subtle, texts from mutual friends, trying to mediate, casual comments from his sister about how dramatic I was being, and thinly veiled suggestions that I should just forgive and move on. "Come on," his sister wrote one morning, her tone clipped, yet somehow patronizing. "You know he didn't mean it. It was a harmless joke." I stared at the screen, the coffee in my hand growing cold. Harmless? Sitting on another man's lap for hours, whispering and laughing intimately, dismissing my feelings publicly. How was that harmless? I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, feeling the familiar churn of anger and betrayal rise again. Then came his parents. They didn't call directly, but through his sister, I received a barrage of messages expressing disappointment, subtly questioning my judgment, hinting that perhaps I had overreacted. "He's a good boy," one note read. "Maybe you're being too sensitive. Families go through conflicts all the time." The insidious part wasn't just their defense of Ethan, it was how it made me question myself. I replayed every word, every interaction, looking for the moments I could have been more accommodating, more understanding, more patient. And yet, each time I did, I came back to the same stark truth. The problem was never me. The problem had always been him, and his inability to respect me or honor the trust I gave freely. The escalation didn't stop there. Additional evidence began surfacing, seemingly small, but undeniably damning. Colt, my friend and confidant, quietly handed me screenshots of texts between Ethan and Mara, where they laughed about my overreaction and strategized how Ethan could maintain appearances while pursuing other women. There were photos from other nights, subtle moments at bars and gatherings, showing him leaning into other women while texting me reassurances. Each one landed like a hammer blow. I remember the night I confronted him in person. It was inevitable. The moment was tense, electric. My hands clenched at my sides, my jaw tight. Ethan tried to smile, tried to explain, but I stopped him with a look. "Stop. Just stop," I said. "I know everything. The texts, the photos, the manipulations. Don't even start." He attempted to justify himself, his words tumbling over each other. "I didn't mean to hurt you. It wasn't physical. I was just confused." I shook my head, feeling a sharp, cold clarity settle over me. "Confused?" I repeated, voice steady, measured. "You've been planning, strategizing, testing me, all while pretending to love me. That's not confusion. That's deceit." The argument spiraled, as arguments tend to do when years of trust and affection clash with betrayal. Friends chimed in via text, some taking sides, others just observing the chaos. Each intervention, each whispered, "Maybe you should," or "He's a good guy," only fueled my inner fire. I realized that the battle wasn't just with Ethan. It was with everyone who had allowed his behavior to slide, who had normalized the disrespect, and who had attempted to frame me as the problem for choosing myself. But within this storm, something remarkable happened. With every piece of evidence, every pointed comment from family or friends, every confrontation, I felt myself shifting. The fear, the self-doubt, the aching uncertainty, they began to transform into a quiet, unshakable strength. I understood, finally, that my value wasn't defined by his approval, nor by the validation of those who had shielded his behavior. My self-worth existed independently of him. It was during a particularly tense confrontation with Mara that I felt the full weight of this change. Mara had been a friend, a casual ally in the early months of our relationship, but she had also been complicit, or at least aware of Ethan's strategies. She tried to speak on his behalf, suggesting I overreacted, that perhaps I didn't understand his perspective. I held up my hand, silencing her mid-sentence. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice calm, unwavering. "I understand the choices he made, the games he played, and the way he treated me. I also understand my own worth, and I know that I am not defined by his respect or lack thereof." Mara looked taken aback, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't triumph or vindication. It was recognition of my own power, my own agency. I realized I could walk away without drama, without imploring him to change, without begging for what I had already earned by simply existing. The escalation reached its peak when more friends and acquaintances began quietly sharing stories of Ethan's patterns, small incidents that now, when pieced together, revealed a long history of emotional manipulation and testing. It was as if the veil had been lifted from the world, and I could see clearly the intricate web of deceit that had been carefully woven around me. And in that clarity, I felt a profound transformation. I was no longer the uncertain, questioning woman who had walked into Mara's party, heart heavy with confusion. I was a woman who had seen the truth, faced it, and decided she deserved more. I understood now that his friends, his family, even his own apologies, they were irrelevant to my decision. What mattered was my recognition of my own boundaries and my refusal to compromise them for anyone. By the time the week ended, I had started reclaiming my life. I was no longer reacting to the chaos around me. I was observing it, analyzing it, and letting it inform my choices without allowing it to dictate my emotions. My interactions with Ethan became minimal, deliberate, and emotionally controlled. I had learned in the most painful way that true strength is not in fighting for someone who refuses to honor you, but in standing firm, choosing yourself, and letting the consequences unfold naturally. The transformation was subtle yet profound. Every confrontation, every proof of deceit, every attempted manipulation, each one chipped away at the lingering fear and self-doubt, leaving in its place a quiet resilience. I was beginning to see myself not as a victim, but as a woman who had endured, observed, and grown stronger through adversity. And though the storm of family, friends, and evidence still swirled around me, I finally understood something critical. I was no longer at the mercy of anyone else's narrative. I had reclaimed my story, and that reclamation was more powerful than any confrontation, any argument, or any apology Ethan could offer. Even with clarity and resilience beginning to take root, there was a darkness I couldn't escape. It came in quiet moments, long after the confrontations, when I was alone in my apartment or walking home from work under the dim streetlights. The betrayal still clung to me, not as a scream, but as a low, unrelenting hum. A reminder that the person I had trusted most had used me as a placeholder, a stepping stone for someone he deemed more suitable. The first night alone after the confrontations, I sat on the edge of my bed, my hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm tea, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing down on my shoulders. My mind replayed Ethan's face, the calm arrogance in his dismissal, the cold clarity with which he had treated me like a project rather than a partner. The tears came quietly at first, then faster, hot and bitter. I wondered, not for the first time, how I had been so blind. Months of warning signs, of subtle manipulations, had passed under my radar. How could someone so close, someone I loved, have such a capacity for duplicity? My chest ached with the knowledge that my trust had been exploited so thoroughly. Even now, as I sipped my tea and tried to steady my breathing, the sting of humiliation lingered. Sleep offered no escape. In dreams, the party replayed endlessly. Ethan and Catherine sitting together, whispering, laughing, intimate gestures, the warmth between them that had been denied to me. I would wake in a cold sweat, heart pounding, convinced that the betrayal was more immediate than the passing of days. I was haunted not just by the actions themselves, but by the realization of how deep the deception had gone and how carefully it had been orchestrated. Even the support of friends couldn't fully penetrate the isolation I felt. They could see the truth, comfort me, reassure me, but they couldn't undo the betrayal, couldn't remove the sting from my chest. I was left alone with my thoughts, wrestling with a sense of profound loneliness. How had love, trust, and shared memories become tools for manipulation? How could someone I had invested so deeply in, emotionally and mentally, have treated me as disposable? Walking through the city streets, I felt invisible, as though I were a ghost observing a life I no longer belonged to. Each laugh from a passing group, each couple holding hands, each glimpse of intimacy seemed to amplify my own absence, my own displacement. It was as if the world was mocking the naivety and hope I had carried for months. Even mundane tasks, making coffee, feeding my cat, checking messages, felt heavy, imbued with a melancholy I couldn't shake. I found myself questioning my judgment, my instincts, the very nature of my worth. Was I too trusting, too naive, too desperate to hold on to love? The questions circled endlessly, each one sharp as a knife, cutting at the edges of my confidence. And yet, even in the depths of this despair, there was a small, stubborn spark. It wasn't hope for reconciliation or for Ethan to change. It was a recognition that I still existed, still had agency, still had the capacity to choose myself above all else. The spark was fragile, easily overshadowed by grief and rage, but it was there, quietly persistent. One evening, as I sat on my balcony, staring at the city lights flickering like distant stars, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of everything: betrayal, humiliation, anger, sadness, loneliness. I let it pour out, tears falling freely, chest aching, the night echoing with the emptiness of my solitude. And then, slowly, I let a single thought take hold. This isn't the end. I am still here. I am still whole. It was in that darkness, in that raw, unfiltered pain, that I first realized the depth of my own strength. The despair was absolute, yes, but it was also a crucible, forging a clarity and resilience I hadn't known I possessed. I could feel the beginnings of a transformation, though it was shrouded in the ache of loss. The recognition was painful, but undeniable. I was no longer a passive participant in someone else's narrative. I was reclaiming my story, one tremulous step at a time. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't cry to exhaustion. I sat with the darkness, naming it, feeling it, and quietly making a promise to myself. I would emerge from this, stronger, wiser, and uncompromising. I would not let betrayal define me. I would not let deception erode my self-worth. And though the road ahead was uncertain, though the loneliness pressed against me like a physical weight, I knew that this darkness was temporary. It was the crucible before the dawn. By the time dawn crept through the curtains, pale and hesitant, I felt a faint, almost imperceptible shift. The hollow ache was still there, but so was the spark. The recognition that I had survived the worst of it, that I had faced betrayal in its most intimate and cutting form, and that I had remained intact enough to reclaim myself. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a deep, unbroken breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. The road ahead was unclear, but for the first time, I believed I had the strength to walk it on my own terms. It was late one evening, the kind of quiet night where the city seemed to hold its breath, that I stumbled upon the final pieces of clarity. Colt had been helping me organize the screenshots, the texts, the photos, and other small but telling moments that had accumulated over months. We spread everything across his kitchen table, evidence, messages, and notes, each item like a breadcrumb leading to a single, undeniable truth. I picked up my phone and scrolled through one particular conversation that Mara had forwarded, a message that had gone unnoticed in my initial review. It was from the night of the party, hours after I had walked away, a candid exchange between Ethan and Catherine. They were laughing, planning their time together, exchanging intimate remarks that were meant to be hidden but had been captured nonetheless. The casualness in his tone made my stomach twist. It wasn't excitement, it wasn't attraction, it was calculation. I felt my hands tremble, the last traces of doubt melting into anger and resolution. Everything. The late nights, the dismissals, the boundary tests fit into a pattern I could no longer ignore. It wasn't a series of mistakes. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was deliberate, and I had spent months rationalizing it, hoping he would grow or understand. Sitting there, surrounded by irrefutable evidence, I finally allowed myself to see him as he truly was. Someone who had never treated me as an equal, never respected my boundaries, and never truly valued my presence. Every moment of supposed affection, every "I love you," every excuse for inappropriate behavior, all now revealed as shared of a carefully constructed facade. Colt, sensing the shift in me, didn't interrupt. He just nodded, giving me the space to process. "You see it now," he said quietly. I nodded, the words heavy but clear. "I do. I see it all." The realization hit me harder than any confrontation or argument could. I had been holding on to a man who saw me not as a partner, but as a project, a placeholder, a test. I had been giving love where there was none to be received, and in doing so, I had been eroding my own worth, my own identity. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully feel the anger, the hurt, the betrayal, but also the clarity and empowerment that came with understanding. I realized that the responsibility for his actions did not lie with me, and that I did not need to endure further disrespect or manipulation. I could choose myself, and I would. I thought of every moment he had dismissed me in front of friends, every time he had subtly undermined my confidence, every encounter where he had prioritized someone else over me. I remembered the suffocating feeling at the party, the surreal horror of watching him embrace another woman while pretending to the world, and to me, that nothing was wrong. And then, amidst the fury and the heartbreak, a quiet but undeniable strength emerged. I understood that my life, my happiness, and my self-respect were mine to protect. I didn't need to argue, plead, or convince him of his wrongdoing. The evidence spoke for itself, and more importantly, my own heart spoke for itself. I made my decision with absolute clarity. I would leave. I would reclaim the life I had invested in him emotionally, mentally, and spiritually, and I would refuse to let his deception define me. This wasn't a dramatic act of vengeance. It was a deliberate, intentional choice to honor myself, to set boundaries, and to refuse to tolerate further disrespect. The following day, I drafted a note. Simple, direct, honest. I didn't need to explain, to justify, or to argue. The note read, "I've seen the truth. I know the choices you've made. I have loved, trusted, and given everything I could, and it has been taken for granted. I am choosing myself now. This ends here." I left it on the kitchen counter, my bag packed, and walked out of the apartment without looking back. Each step felt lighter than the last. The city around me was the same, but I felt a profound shift within myself. I was no longer someone trapped by fear, hope, or uncertainty. I was free to reclaim my story, to rebuild my life on my terms, and to protect the boundaries that defined my self-worth. Later that evening, I met with Mara to return a few things and to clarify my own boundaries with the people who had been complicit in Ethan's games. She watched me carefully, probably expecting a confrontation or an emotional collapse. Instead, she saw a woman calm, resolute, and in command of her own life. "I'm done," I said softly but firmly. "With him, with the manipulation, with all of it, and I'm not looking back." She nodded slowly, a hint of surprise in her expression. I didn't realize how deep it went," she admitted. "I did," I replied. "And now I see clearly. My life doesn't need to include anyone who doesn't value me, who doesn't respect me, or who treats me like a backup plan. I deserve better. I choose better." Walking away from that meeting, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in months, maybe even years, I felt fully aligned with myself, fully present, fully empowered. The heartbreak was real. The betrayal undeniable, but so too was my strength. I had faced the truth, claimed it, and made the choice to protect my own life and happiness. This was not the end of the story, but it was a definitive turning point. The darkness had been acknowledged, the deception exposed, and my path forward, uncertain but mine, was clear. I was no longer a passive participant in someone else's narrative. I was the author of my own life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt capable of writing it with intention, clarity, and self-respect. The morning after I left, the silence in the apartment felt almost sacred. I didn't check my phone, didn't glance at messages, didn't look back. The absence of Ethan's presence was liberating, not sorrowful. I had chosen this, and for the first time in months, I felt the calm certainty of my own agency. Meanwhile, the world Ethan had constructed around himself, carefully curated to maintain appearances, began to unravel. The texts, the photos, the evidence I had left behind circulated quietly at first, shared among friends who had been suspicious but hesitant to confront the reality. By noon, whispers turned into discussions, discussions into judgments. It was subtle at first, a friend expressing doubt about Ethan's story, a coworker noticing his tense demeanor, his attempts at casual conversation falling flat. It wasn't long before the ripple effect hit him where it hurt most. Credibility. Friends who had once admired him, who had trusted his charm and social ease, started questioning his integrity. People who had been quietly aware of his manipulations felt vindicated, but also disturbed by the depth of deceit. A few mutual friends reached out to me, not to reconcile, not to judge, but to confirm that they had seen patterns themselves, patterns they had been unwilling to acknowledge while I was still in the relationship. Ethan tried to contain the fallout. He called friends, explained away situations, attempted to minimize the significance of the party, of the texts, of the months of strategic boundary testing. But no one could look at him the same way again. The carefully maintained image of a charming, trustworthy partner cracked, and every lie, every dismissal, every calculated slight surfaced like debris in the wake of a storm. At work, news of his betrayal spread in hushed tones among mutual acquaintances. People who had attended the party began piecing together timelines, cross-referencing stories, confirming what I already knew. The realization that he had treated someone he supposedly loved as expendable and as a means to an end stung sharply in a way that public scrutiny often does. His excuses fell flat. The pattern was clear. Family, too, felt the tremors. Ethan's parents had long held expectations, subtle but unyielding, for me to fit into a mold of patience, decorum, and deference. They had quietly resented the tension, the challenges to their perception of him. Now, with the truth undeniable, they began questioning him directly. Calls came, not to discuss reconciliation, but to probe, to understand, to hold him accountable for the treatment of someone they had come to care for, even if from a distance. The weight of his dishonesty pressed in from every direction. Meanwhile, I had found myself in a rare space of peace. I returned to Colt's apartment, where the quiet hum of normalcy greeted me like an old friend. We shared simple routines, making coffee, watching the city at dusk, playing cards, and laughing over small, inconsequential games. These mundane acts felt monumental in contrast to the chaos I had left behind. Each moment reinforced the clarity I had gained. My life was mine, and it was unshackled from Ethan's manipulation. I heard about his attempts to contact me, calls, texts, even a few appearances at my workplace, but I stayed silent. I didn't need confrontation to validate my choice. The truth had already spoken, and in that silence, I maintained control over my narrative. Each outreach from him became a reminder of the choice I had made, to prioritize my dignity, my self-respect, and my peace of mind over appeasing someone who had repeatedly disregarded me. The day I returned some personal items to the apartment we had shared was a quiet, deliberate act. I left behind nothing of my own but retrieved what was mine, taking care not to look at the spaces that had once held memories of a love I had cherished, but that had been weaponized against me. Standing there, keys in hand, I felt no anger, no desire for revenge. I simply felt free. The apartment, the furniture, even the small mementos of our time together, none of it held power over me anymore. In the following days, the social fallout continued to intensify. Friends who had once sided with him now approached cautiously, their tone measured. "I had no idea," they would say, eyes wide. "We suspected something, but—" The words hung in the air, a mixture of astonishment and the quiet condemnation of someone finally confronted with the truth. Ethan's attempts to explain, to charm, to spin, all crumbled in the face of the evidence I had left behind. And through it all, I observed from a distance, my heart no longer a battlefield. I wasn't gloating, wasn't savoring the discomfort he felt. I was simply witnessing the natural consequences of dishonesty, manipulation, and disrespect. Karma, if it existed, was playing out without my interference. The world had corrected itself, and I was free to move forward without carrying the burden of his mistakes. As I walked home one evening, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows across the streets, I realized how far I had come. The fear, the heartbreak, the sense of betrayal, they had been intense, almost unbearable, but they had also forged resilience and self-awareness. I had emerged whole, grounded in my own worth, and aware of what I would no longer tolerate. This was my liberation, leaving behind a man who had underestimated me, abandoning a narrative that had kept me trapped, and stepping into a life guided by my own values and respect. The chaos, the drama, the fallout, they were not my burden anymore. I had chosen clarity, dignity, and freedom, and with each step away from the wreckage, I reclaimed pieces of myself I hadn't known were missing. I didn't look back. I didn't second guess. I only moved forward, carrying with me the knowledge that I had honored my own truth, and that in doing so, I had found something far more valuable than any relationship ever could be: the unshakable certainty that I am enough, just as I am. The weeks that followed were quiet, but profound. Freed from Ethan's manipulation and the constant anxiety of walking on eggshells, I began to rediscover myself in ways I hadn't thought possible. I slept without tension clawing at my chest. I laughed without hesitation. I made small choices: what to cook, which route to take, which book to read, that weren't influenced by fear, expectation, or the need to appease someone else. Each choice, each small act, reminded me that my life belonged to me alone. I started reconnecting with friends who had been quietly supportive all along. Mara, who had once hesitated to speak up about Ethan's behavior, became a trusted confidant. We shared coffee, stories, and honest conversations that reminded me how rare it is to find people who see and respect your worth. These interactions weren't about dwelling on the past. They were about grounding myself in the present and building a future free from deceit. Work, too, took on a new meaning. Tasks I had once found mundane, the hum of the cash register, helping customers, organizing stock, became anchors of stability. I took pride in my own competence, my patience, my ability to navigate challenges without needing validation from someone who had never truly valued me. The satisfaction came from knowing that my worth was intrinsic, not contingent on someone else's approval. Reflection became a daily practice. I thought about how easily I had been manipulated, how I had ignored subtle warnings, and how I had rationalized disrespect. But rather than dwell in guilt, I used these reflections as lessons. I reminded myself that recognizing red flags, honoring boundaries, and valuing one's own feelings are not just acts of self-preservation. They are essential to maintaining dignity, self-respect, and emotional health. I also understood that love, when it is real and mutual, does not demand that you shrink yourself, sacrifice your identity, or tolerate manipulation. The right person will see your strengths, respect your limits, and cherish you as you are. This realization was liberating. I didn't need Ethan's approval, his affection, or his validation. I had all I needed within myself. By the time the sun set on another quiet evening, I felt a deep sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't resentful. I was empowered. My heartbreak had not destroyed me. It had clarified me. It had taught me that self-worth cannot be outsourced, that boundaries are sacred, and that freedom comes from valuing yourself enough to walk away from anyone who does not honor you. And so I move forward, not with revenge in mind, not with longing, not with fear, but with strength, clarity, and an unwavering commitment to myself. Life will continue to offer choices, relationships, challenges, and joys, but I now navigate them from a place of self-respect. To anyone watching, anyone who has felt betrayed, humiliated, or undervalued, your value is not defined by how someone else treats you. Protect it fiercely, honor your boundaries, trust your instincts, and above all, never settle for being a backup plan. The moment you recognize your worth is the moment you reclaim your life, and there is no power greater than that. I am whole, I am enough, and finally, I am free.